High on everyone's agenda was the theory of invisibility. Any military commander in the field who had the ability to conceal his troops and weaponry at will could deal the enemy a knockout blow. Camouflage and invisibility had been key factors to the success and safety of fighting men on all sides throughout the history of warfare. During the First World War, military artists painted warships and merchant ships in a disruptive pattern, making them harder to identify. This technique was known as dazzle. Bold patterns, shapes and colors were applied to ships in such a way that when viewed through the periscope of a submarine or from an enemy ship, they couldn't be seen clearly against the horizon. It was almost impossible for the enemy to gauge the correct range at which to fire its guns or torpedoes. As technology became more advanced, particularly at sea, so too did the art of camouflage. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, planes became more prevalent as weapons of war, but dazzle could not protect ships from the air. It was obvious something much more sophisticated was required. With the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941, some of the best scientific brains in the world were harnessed to discover whether invisibility was a viable proposition, especially for ships. If such a thing were possible, then the war at sea could be won. Many of the scientists working for the Allies were German Jews, driven from their homeland in the 1930s by Hitler's Aryan policies. Albert Einstein was one of them. Born in 1879, Einstein was a mathematical physicist years ahead of his time. He'd arrived in the US in 1932, and a year later become a professor at Princeton University. In August 1939, when the start of the Second World War in Europe was less than a month away, Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, warning him of Germany's plans to harness nuclear energy for military purposes. In 1942, as a direct result of Einstein's letter, the US government authorized its own nuclear weapons program, called the Manhattan Project. It was the most secret scientific operation of the entire war. Meanwhile, the US Defense Department employed Einstein's genius in helping to create a less destructive, but nonetheless effective means of winning the war. Whether or not this led to the Philadelphia experiment is not known. Although no official records of the experiment apparently exist, and the Office of Naval Research has always denied that such an experiment ever took place, this, according to Allende, is what is supposed to have occurred. In the summer of 1943, the USS Eldridge was fitted with tons of electronic equipment, including 2 huge generators mounted in place of the forward gun turret. At 9 a.m. on the 22nd of July, the generators were switched on. Within a few minutes, the ship was surrounded by a hazy green fog. Then it completely vanished. 15 minutes later, the generators were turned off and the ship slowly materialized again through the green fog. The crew was found dazed and feeling sick. 3 months later, on the 28th of October, the Navy was ready for another try, this time out in the open sea. The generators were turned on, and as before, a green fog slowly enveloped the ship as she disappeared. Within seconds, she materialized briefly in Norfolk, Virginia, 300 miles away, before reappearing at the Philadelphia Naval Yard a few moments later. But this time, the effect on the crew was much more traumatic. Some were so disturbed that they were committed to psychiatric hospitals for the rest of their lives. According to Allende, their families were told they'd been killed in action. The US Navy decided not to repeat the experiment. The US authorities have always dismissed his account as pure fiction. But there are still those who believe that the US Navy has its own reasons for still wanting to keep the real truth behind the Philadelphia experiment, a closely guarded secret. The USS Eldridge was built in Newark, New Jersey, and launched in the summer of 1943. According to US Navy records, the ship then remained in New York and Long Island Sound until the 16th of September, when she sailed to Bermuda to undergo sea trials. In mid-October, the Eldridge returned to New York in a convoy. 2 weeks later, she was called to the US Navy base in Norfolk. From there, she sailed for Casablanca, arriving on the 22nd of November. By mid-December, the Eldridge was back in New York, where she remained for 2 weeks, taking part in a training exercise before heading to Norfolk once again. In the first week of January 1944, she was sent out into the North Atlantic as one of the escort ships to a large merchant convoy. Then on to the Mediterranean, where she supported the Allied operations in North Africa. At no time, insisted the US Navy, was the Eldridge anywhere near Philadelphia. If the Navy records are true, then what prompted Allende to write to Jessup claiming to have witnessed the apparent disappearance and teleportation of the Eldridge between Philadelphia and Norfolk? There's no doubt that Allende served as a deckhand aboard the Liberty ship, the Furoseth. But were his ship and the Eldridge ever in the same area at the same time? According to Navy records, the Eldridge left Newark for Brooklyn on the 17th of August 1943 and arrived there the next day. The Furoseth sailed from Norfolk on the 16th of August, traveling up the coast in a convoy before heading east towards North Africa. It's quite possible she passed the Eldridge en route to Brooklyn as the destroyer emerged from Delaware Bay on the morning of the 17th. Did Allende really see something strange as the two ships drew near, and over the next few years become confused in his own mind over dates and locations? He was adamant he had watched the Eldridge materialize in Norfolk and then vanish again, turning up in Philadelphia a few moments later. But he told no one at the time, and certainly from that day to this, no one has ever corroborated his incredible story. Later, Lieutenant William Dodge, master of the Furoseth, categorically denied that either he or any of his crew had seen anything unusual while in Norfolk. And William Van Allen, captain of the Eldridge, said that his ship had never been to Philadelphia.